The man from Pruitt Land Cattle set the paper on the gatepost and said the words like he was ordering breakfast. "You have until sundown Friday. After that, this land belongs to the company." He didn't wait for an answer. He mounted up and rode back to the 6 men who were already watching from the road. None of them looked at the woman in the doorway. None of them needed to. She had already read the document. It was the 3rd one that year. The first had given her 30 days. The second had given her a week. This one gave her until the end of the week, and it carried the state seal and the signature of a territorial judge she had never met. Her name was Vera Caldwell, and the land she stood on was 640 acres of federal preemption claim that her husband had filed 4 years before Pruitt Land Cattle Company ever existed. The man on the road took out a cigarette and struck a match against his saddle horn. The flame caught on the first strike, which meant the day was dry and the wind was moving east. He looked back once, briefly, the way a man looks at a horse he's already decided to buy. The stranger had been watching from the tree line for 11 minutes. He had counted the men, 7 on the road, including the one who had ridden up to the gate. He had counted their rifles, 6 long guns, 2 sidearms visible, the 7th man carrying something wrapped in canvas that might have been a shotgun or might have been a contract. He had read their posture from 400 yards. The leader sat his horse in the center, which meant he was in charge but not the smartest. The smartest man was the one on the left edge who hadn't moved his hand from his thigh since arriving, because he was keeping his draw arm free. The stranger had noted the specific way the leader's horse kept shifting its weight, which told him the animal had been ridden hard that morning and hadn't been cooled properly, which told him these men had come from town in a hurry, which told him Pruitt had sent them with a deadline, and the deadline was real. The stranger had noted all of this before the gatepost conversation began. He had already decided to stay. His horse stood behind the cottonwood line, reins looped over a low branch. The knot he tied was patient. 3 wraps, a clean half-hitch, the kind of knot a man uses when he doesn't know how long he'll be but knows it won't be brief. The horse's ears were fixed on the road, not the farmhouse. The stranger had learned to trust his horse's ears more than his own eyes. The horse saw danger before the man did, every time, without fail, and what the horse's ears were telling him now was that the 7 men on the road were not the whole problem. They were the visible part. The rest was somewhere south, behind a desk, reading reports. He waited until the men rode off. He waited a full minute after they disappeared past the rise, because the leader had looked back once, and the man on the left edge had looked back twice, and twice meant he was supposed to watch the property for movement. The stranger let them clear the ridgeline. Then he stepped out of the cottonwood shade and walked toward the farmhouse. The woman was still standing in the doorway. She held the removal order in her left hand and a Spencer carbine in her right. And she was not holding the rifle the way a frightened person holds a rifle. She was holding it the way a person holds a tool they have used before and will use again. The stranger stopped at the fence line. He did not climb over. He put his hands where she could see them, which was a courtesy, not a submission, and he said, "How long has Pruitt been pressing you?" She studied him for a long time. The way he stood, weight on his back foot, hands open at his sides, eyes steady but not aggressive, told her enough. He was not one of them. He was also not a deputy, a lawyer, or a preacher, because those men all carried their authority in their faces. This man carried nothing in his face at all. He was a blank surface, and that was more interesting than any of the alternatives. 18 months, she said, since Henry died. What did your husband file? Federal preemption, 1876, 640 acres. The filing number is in the house. Pruitt's claim is a state-chartered grazing lease from 1878. Yes. Your husband's filing is older. By 2 years. Then Pruitt's charter can't legally cover your land. He has a territorial judge. Who says it can? The stranger looked at the document in her hand. He did not ask to read it. He did not need to. The seal, the weight of the paper, the specific font of the territorial printing. He had seen enough of those documents in enough other valleys to know what this one said without reading the words. It would cite a survey. The survey would show Pruitt's grazing lease overlapping the Croft claim. The survey would be wrong, but it would have the right signatures and the right stamps, and in a territory where the federal land office received 1 report per quarter and the territorial judge held court in a saloon back room, a wrong survey with the right stamps was the same thing as truth. 14 families, he said. She blinked. What? 14 families have lost land to Pruitt in this valley. You're the 15th, or the last one. How do you know that? He did not answer the question. He looked at the cottonwood line where his horse was standing, then back at the farmhouse, then at the empty road where the 7 men had been. He was doing something he always did when he arrived at a place. He was counting the distance between the house and the road, the fence line and the tree cover, the angle of the sun against the ridgeline that would determine shadow positions at different hours. He was building a map in his head, and the map had 2 functions. It showed him how to leave if he needed to leave, and it showed him how to hold the ground if he needed to hold it. Can I see the filing? He asked. She looked at him for another 5 seconds. Then she stepped back from the doorway and let him in. The house was clean, not polished, clean the way a house is when one person maintains it alone, and maintains it well because the alternative is admitting that the effort is no longer worth it. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, though only one showed where, a shelf with 3 books, a Bible, a farming almanac from 1877, and a volume of poems he did not recognize. On the wall above the shelf, a tintype of a man with a full beard and a woman standing beside him. The man's hand was on the woman's shoulder but not gripping it, resting there, the way a hand rests when it has been placed in that position 1,000 times, and the placement has become a kind of language. The strong box was under the bed. She pulled it out without hesitation and opened it with a key she kept on a cord around her neck. Inside were 4 documents: the original preemption filing, a receipt for the filing fee, a hand-drawn map of the claim boundaries, and a letter from the Federal Land Office in Fort Worth confirming receipt of the filing. The letter was dated March 1876. The seal was intact. The stranger read each document in silence. He held them the way a man holds evidence he has been looking for. Carefully, without folding, without smudging. He checked the filing number against the receipt. He compared the claim boundaries on the hand-drawn map to the description in the filing. He noted the signature of the registering clerk in Fort Worth, a name he did not recognize, but the handwriting was consistent across all 4 documents, which meant they had been processed by the same clerk in the same office on the same day. That was good. It made them harder to challenge. Your husband was careful, the stranger said. He was. This filing predates Pruitt's charter by 2 years. Under federal homestead law, a prior filing supersedes a subsequent state grazing lease on the same acreage. Pruitt's judge says otherwise. Pruitt's judge is a territorial magistrate with authority over territorial disputes. A federal preemption filing falls under federal jurisdiction. A territorial judge can't override it. He already has. The stranger set the documents down on the table. He looked at the 10 type on the wall. He looked at the single worn chair. He looked at the woman who had been holding this house and this land alone for 2 years, against a company that owned a judge, a sheriff, and 7 armed men on horseback. She had not broken. She had not left. She was still here, with a Spencer carbine and a strong box and the knowledge that she was right. And being right had not been enough to stop the documents from coming, one after another, each one tighter than the last, each one designed to squeeze until she cracked or fled. He said, "Do you have anyone else?" "My husband's brother moved to California last year. There is no one." He nodded once. He picked up the documents again and read the Federal Land Office confirmation letter a second time, slower this time. He was looking at something specific, not the seal, not the date, but the clerk's notation in the bottom margin. Most people never read the margin notes. The stranger always did. The margin note said, "Filed under Homestead Act, Section 22-59. Preemption priority established. No conflicting claims on file at time of registration. No conflicting claims on file at time of registration." Pruitt's state charter had been issued 2 years later. But the margin note meant that in March 1876, the Federal Land Office had checked for prior claims and found none. Henry Croft's filing was not just older, it was unchallenged at the time it was recorded. That language mattered. That specific notation was the kind of thing a federal circuit judge would read and understand immediately, because it was the kind of notation that federal clerks were trained to include when a claim had clear priority. The stranger set the letter down. "I need to ride into town," he said. "I'll be back before dark." "What are you going to do?" He did not answer. He walked to the door, stopped, and looked back at the Spencer carbine in her hand. "Do you know how to use that?" "My husband taught me." "Keep it loaded. Don't fire unless someone comes through that door who isn't me." He stepped outside. The sun was halfway down the western sky, which gave him roughly 4 hours of useful daylight. He walked to the cottonwood line, untied his horse, and retied the knot. The same patient knot, 3 wraps and a half hitch, because he was coming back, and the knot was a promise to himself that the ground he was leaving would still be his to return to. He mounted and rode east toward Caldwell Flats. The horse's ears were flat. Not forward, not pinned back. Flat, the specific position that meant the animal had assessed the environment and decided that nothing ahead was immediately dangerous, but everything was suspicious. The stranger trusted that assessment completely. He rode at a steady walk, not pushing the horse, because a man who arrives at a town in a hurry is a man who has something to prove, and a man with something to prove is a man other men test. He arrived at a walk. He tied the horse at the saloon rail with the same knot. He did not go to the saloon. He went to the land registry office. The office was a single room at the back of the general store. The registrar was a man named Holt, thin, mid-50s, the kind of man who had held his position for 20 years, not because he was competent, but because no one else wanted the work. The stranger asked to see the Pruitt Land Cattle Company territorial grazing lease, file number 1878, T447. Holt brought the file without argument. The stranger read it at the counter. He read every page, the charter application, the survey map, the list of acreage, the territorial judge's certification. He read the names of the surveyors who had drawn the map. One name was printed clearly. The other was smudged. The stranger noted the smudge. Then he noted the acreage figures. Pruitt's charter claimed 150,000 acres. The survey map showed the boundaries extending across the entire valley, including every homestead, every preemption claim, every family's land. The map was wrong. Not slightly wrong, deliberately wrong. The boundaries had been drawn to include acreage that no legitimate survey would have captured, because the terrain features marked on the map did not match the actual terrain. A creek was shown flowing east when it flowed north. A ridgeline was drawn 2 miles from its actual position. These were not surveying errors. These were choices. "Who conducted this survey?" the stranger asked. Holt looked at the page. "Tom Birch, and one other. The second name is hard to read." "Where is Tom Birch now?" "He works out of the Amarillo boarding house on 2nd Street. He's Pruitt's land agent, or he was." "Was?" "Pruitt let him go about a year ago. Birch has been drinking since." The stranger closed the file. He thanked Holt, walked to the telegraph office, and sent one message. It was addressed to the Federal Circuit Court in Fort Worth. It contained a filing number, a date, and a request for confirmation of priority status under Section 2259 of the Homestead Act. It did not contain his name. It did not explain why the request mattered. Federal clerks were trained to respond to filing numbers. They did not need context. They needed the number and the date, and they would respond within 2 days. He paid for the telegram, walked to his horse, and untied the knot. The horse's ears came forward, not flat now, but upright and tracking, the position that meant the animal had registered a change in environment that might or might not be relevant. The stranger rode back toward the Caldwell homestead. The sun was dropping behind him. He had 3 days. The removal order said sundown Friday. It was Tuesday evening. 72 hours, give or take. Enough time if the telegram was answered promptly. Not enough time if it wasn't. He arrived at the farmhouse just as the last light was leaving the valley. The door was closed but not locked. He knocked twice, waited, and entered when she opened it. The Spencer carbine was on the table, loaded, hammered down. She had done what he told her. She had also lit 2 lamps and set out a plate of food. Cornbread and dried meat, simple and sufficient. He ate without speaking. She sat across from him and watched him eat the way a woman watches a stranger in her house, and decides bite by bite whether to trust him further or keep the rifle closer. "What's your name?" she asked. He set down the cornbread. "It doesn't matter," he said. He slept in the barn that night, not because she asked him to, because the barn had a clear sight line to the road and the tree line, and because the horse would hear anything moving on the approach before he did. He slept with his rifle across his chest and his hat over his face. And the horse stood in the stall with its ears up, and nothing came down the road that night. Nothing needed to yet. The deadline was 3 days. The man behind the desk was reading reports and drinking whiskey and believing, with the calm certainty of a man who had never been challenged, that the removal order would be obeyed the way the other 14 had been obeyed, with silence, with packing, with a wagon on the road by first light. Subscribe to Frontier Reckoning. This story has 5 acts. The part where 7 armed men ride into that yard is still ahead. Stay. The stranger woke before light. He knew it the way a man always knows it, not from the quality of darkness, but from the horse. The animal had shifted in its stall sometime in the last few minutes, a single adjustment of weight from the resting leg to the standing leg. And that sound, that small redistribution of mass against straw and packed earth, was a better clock than any the railroad had ever built. The stranger rose from the hay. He checked the rifle by touch. Lever free, magazine loaded, hammer on half cock. He stepped to the barn door and looked east. The sky was a thin line of gray above the ridgeline, the specific gray that means the sun is still 20 minutes below the horizon, but the light is already moving through the upper atmosphere, getting ready. The road was empty. The farmhouse was quiet. The cottonwood leaves were motionless, which meant no wind yet, which meant sound would carry far today. He walked to the farmhouse and knocked twice. She opened the door with the carbine in her hand, same as the night before. She had slept in her clothes. He could tell from the creases in the sleeves and the way the collar sat. Not wrong, but not fresh. She had slept sitting up or close to it, and she had kept the rifle within reach the entire night. He respected that. A woman alone in a contested house who sleeps with a loaded weapon is a woman who understands her situation clearly, and clear understanding was the only thing he could work with. "I need to go to Amarillo," he said. "I need to find someone Pruitt fired." Pruitt fires men who disappoint him. This one disappointed him by keeping records. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Tom Birch." He did not react visibly, but inside the assessment shifted. She knew the name. She had known it before he arrived, and she had not mentioned it, which meant either she did not trust Birch, or she did not trust him, or she was the kind of person who held information in reserve until the moment it could do the most work. He decided it was the third. "You know where he is?" "The boarding house on 2nd Street. The one with the green shutters. He drinks at the saloon next door starting around noon. Before noon, he's usually in his room." "How do you know that?" "Because he came to my door 9 months ago and told me he was sorry for what he'd done to my land. He was sober then. He hasn't been sober since." The stranger noted this. A man who apologizes to the victim of his own fraud and then drinks himself into incapacity is a man carrying a weight he cannot set down alone. He is also a man who will produce the evidence if someone arrives at the right moment with the right question. Not a threat, not a bribe, just the simple presence of someone willing to carry what he has been holding. He rode for Amarillo. The distance was 6 hours by the pace he kept, which was not fast and not slow, because the horse needed to arrive with energy and reserve, and because a man who arrives at a boarding house in a hurry is a man who telegraphs his intentions to every window on the street. He arrived just past noon. The sun was high and vertical, compressing every shadow to its minimum length. He tied the horse at the rail outside the saloon, the same patient knot, and walked past the saloon door, without entering. He went next door to the boarding house. The green shutters were closed on the 2nd floor. The landlady was a heavy woman with flour on her forearms, who looked at him the way boarding house landladies look at every man who walks in without luggage, with suspicion calibrated to exactly the level the moment required. "I'm looking for Tom Birch." "Room 7. Upstairs, end of the hall. He's paid through the week." "I'm not collecting. I need to talk to him. He doesn't get many visitors." "That's about to change." She studied him for a moment. Something in his stillness, the way he stood without fidgeting, without glancing around, without performing the restless energy of a man with an agenda, told her that this visitor was different from the ones who came to collect debts or deliver warnings. She pointed at the stairs without further comment. Room 7 was at the end of a narrow hallway that smelled of lye soap and old pipe tobacco. The door was thin enough that he could hear the sound of someone breathing on the other side. Not sleeping, not moving, just breathing in the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who was awake and had been awake for some time, and was lying on a bed staring at a ceiling he had memorized long ago. He knocked. The breathing stopped. Then a voice, rough and dry. "Who is it?" "Someone who read your survey." Silence. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of a man who has been waiting 3 years for that sentence, and is now hearing it, and is not entirely certain he is awake. The door opened. Tom Birch was thin in the way that drinking men get thin, not from lack of food, but from the specific metabolic theft that alcohol performs on a body over time. His eyes were clear, which meant he had been sober since the night before. His hands were steady, which meant the worst of the shaking had passed. He was maybe 40, but the drinking had added years to his face in the places where years show first. the corners of the eyes, the creases around the mouth, the specific quality of skin that has lost its elastic confidence. "Who are you?" Birch asked. "Someone who looked at the survey map in the territorial filing and saw a creek flowing east that actually flows north." Birch's mouth opened, then closed. He looked down the hallway in both directions, the way a man checks for witnesses before saying something he has kept inside for 3 years. Then he stepped back and gestured the stranger into the room. The room was small: a bed, a washstand, a trunk at the foot of the bed, and a window with the green shutters closed against the noon sun. The trunk was locked with a padlock that showed no rust, which meant it was opened regularly, which meant whatever was inside was something Birch looked at, even if he never showed it to anyone else. "I drew that map," Birch said. "Pruitt told me the boundaries. I told him the terrain didn't match. He said the terrain wasn't paying my salary, so I drew what he told me to draw. And then? And then I watched 14 families lose their land because of a map I made with my own hand." He sat on the edge of the bed. His weight made the frame creak. "You know what it's like to visit a widow and tell her the land her husband broke his body to claim isn't hers anymore? I did that. 14 times. Not Pruitt. Me. Because I was the land agent, and the land agent delivers the notices." "Vera Caldwell. She was the last one I visited before Pruitt let me go. I went to her door and told her what I'd done. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She looked at me the way you'd look at a dog that had bitten you. Not angry, just disappointed. That was worse than anything. I went home and started drinking that night, and I haven't stopped." The stranger looked at the trunk. "What's in there?" Birch followed his gaze. Something moved across his face, not fear, not reluctance, but the specific expression of a man who has kept a secret in a locked box for 3 years and is now being asked to open it by someone who already knows what's inside. "Everything," he said. "The original survey measurements, the real boundaries, every document Pruitt told me to destroy, and I kept instead. 3 years of letters, orders, instructions, everything he did, everything I did. Show me." Birch did not move immediately. He sat on the bed and looked at the trunk the way a man looks at a grave he has been visiting, knowing what's there, knowing it needs to be opened, knowing that opening it will change something that cannot be unchanged. Then he reached under the bed and pulled out a key. He unlocked the padlock and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 stacks of paper, each wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture. The stranger knelt beside the trunk and began reading. He read for 40 minutes. He did not speak. He did not look up. He read each document the way he had read Vera Caldwell's filing, carefully, without folding, without rushing, checking names against dates, dates against signatures, signatures against the territorial filing he had read at the registrar's office the day before. The documents told a story that was worse than he had expected. Pruitt had not simply drawn a fraudulent survey. He had built an entire architecture of manufactured legitimacy: false surveys, coerced affidavits, payments to a territorial judge, payments to the county sheriff, a systematic pattern of dispossession that covered the entire valley from the Canadian River tributaries to the eastern ridgeline. 14 families. 12 of them had left. 2 had resisted and been removed by force. Not Pruitt's force, technically, but force executed under the color of legal authority that Pruitt had purchased. But there was something else. Something the stranger had not expected to find. In the middle of the second stack, he came to a page of survey measurements written in a hand he recognized. He had seen that handwriting the day before, in the territorial filing at the registrar's office, in the smudged second name on the survey map. The measurements on this page contradicted the measurements in the filed survey. They were the real measurements, the accurate boundaries of the valley, the correct course of every creek and ridge and drainage, and they were written in the same hand as the false survey. Tom Birch had not just kept the evidence, he had drawn both maps, the real one and the false one. He was the scribe of the fraud and the archivist of the truth, and he had been both at the same time, and the ledger in the stranger's hands was not just Pruitt's conviction, it was Birch's confession. The stranger looked up from the page. Birch was watching him. His face had the specific expression of a man who knows the exact moment his secret became someone else's weapon. "I wrote every word of it," Birch said. "The real one and the false one. I drew the map that took their land, and I kept the map that proves it was stolen. I've been carrying both of those things for 3 years, and I've been drinking because carrying them alone was more than I could do." The stranger said nothing for a long time. Then he asked one question. "Why didn't you take this to the federal land office yourself?" "Because Pruitt owns the sheriff and the judge. I take this to a territorial court. It disappears. I take it to a federal office. Pruitt's men find me before I reach Fort Worth. I've been waiting, not for courage, for someone who could carry it the rest of the way." What I said to him then is not part of this story. It belongs to him. The words of a man unburdening 3 years of guilt to someone he met an hour ago. Whatever the stranger said, or didn't say, was enough. Birch stood up from the bed, walked to the washstand, poured water into the basin, and washed his face with the specific thoroughness of a man preparing to do something he has rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times, but never actually performed. Then he wrapped the documents back in oilcloth, placed them in the stranger's hands, and said, "Take them. All of it, every page." The stranger took the bundle and placed it inside his coat. He looked at Birch one more time, at the clear eyes, the steady hands, the posture of a man who had just set down a weight that had been crushing him for 3 years. "You'll need to testify," the stranger said. "I know. In front of a federal circuit judge, not a territorial magistrate. Federal." "I know. Pruitt will hear about it." "I've been hearing Pruitt in my sleep for 3 years. I'd rather hear him in a courtroom." The stranger nodded once. He left the room, walked down the narrow stairs, and stepped into the noon sun. The street was busy. Wagons, horses, men moving between stores, the normal traffic of a town that did not know it was built on a foundation of stolen land. He walked to the telegraph office and checked for a response to the message he had sent the night before. There was nothing yet. The Federal Circuit Court in Fort Worth operated on its own schedule, which was not fast and was not influenced by the urgency of people waiting. He paid for a second telegram, this one confirming the filing number again and adding 4 words. Priority confirmation needed immediately. He signed it with no name, only the filing number. Federal clerks responded to filing numbers. They did not need names. He walked back to his horse. The animal was standing exactly where he had left it, ears forward, watching the street with the specific alertness of a horse that does not trust a town it has not memorized. The stranger untied the knot and mounted. He rode north, back toward the Caldwell homestead, at the same steady pace he had maintained all morning. He had the ledger. He had the filing. He had a telegram in transit, and a federal judge's jurisdiction waiting on the other end. He had the scribe who had written both the lie and the truth, and the scribe was willing to stand in a room and say so. The sun was 3 hours above the western horizon when he arrived at the farmhouse. Vera Caldwell was on the porch with the Spencer carbine across her knees. She had been watching the road. She did not ask what he had found. She could see it in the way he rode, not faster, not slower, but with the specific posture of a man who has what he needs, and is now waiting for the clock to run out on the other side. "I found your evidence," he said from the saddle. "Tom Birch." "Yes." "Will he testify?" "Yes." She looked at the horizon. The sun was still high enough to give them a full day tomorrow before the Friday deadline. One more day. Enough time if the telegram arrived. Not enough time if it didn't. What happens if the federal court doesn't respond? He did not answer the question directly. He dismounted, tied the horse at the fence line with the patient knot, and said, "The filing predates the charter. That's not an opinion. That's arithmetic. A federal circuit judge will read it the same way I read it. The only question is whether the confirmation arrives before Pruitt's men do." "And if it doesn't?" He looked at her. She was not asking out of fear. She was asking the way a person asks a question they already know the answer to, because knowing the worst version of the truth is better than waiting for it to surprise you. "Then I'll be standing in that yard when they come." He walked to the barn. The horse followed him with its eyes, ears tracking his movement through the open door. He checked the rifle again, not because it needed checking, but because the act of checking was a kind of meditation, a way of telling his hands and his mind that the next 24 hours would require precision, and precision began with the small things. He set the rifle against the stall wall. He sat on the hay bale. He took out Birch's ledger and read it again, slowly this time, memorizing the page numbers, the dates, the specific language of Pruitt's orders. He was not reading for information anymore. He was reading for sequence, the order in which he would present each document to the federal agent, the specific page that would land hardest, the page that would make Pruitt's state charter dissolve like salt in water. The sun set. The valley went dark. The farmhouse lamps came on, one by one, and the silhouette of the woman moved behind the curtains, checking locks, checking the carbine, checking the windows. The stranger watched from the barn. He did not sleep. He sat in the dark, with the ledger in his lap and the horse standing beside him, and he counted the hours until Friday, the way a man counts the distance to a target he has already decided to hit. 2 days left. The stranger slept in the barn that night. Not sleep, not really. He lay on the hay bale with his hat over his eyes and his rifle across his chest, and his mind running through the sequence of everything he had read in Birch's ledger. Page by page, date by date, name by name, and between each page he listened to the horse. The animal stood in the stall with its ears up, rotating them like compass needles, east then north then south, scanning the darkness for something that would change the geometry of the coming day. Nothing came. Dawn arrived the way dawn arrives in the Texas Panhandle, not gradually but as a decision, the sky going from black to gray to pale gold in the space of 20 minutes, as if the sun had grown impatient with the horizon and simply pushed through. The stranger rose. He checked the rifle. He walked to the farmhouse and knocked twice. She opened the door. The carbine was in her hand. The creases in her sleeves were deeper. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Enough. The deadline is tomorrow, sundown." "I know when it is." "Pruitt will send men before then. He won't wait for the deadline. He'll send them tonight or tomorrow morning, because waiting until the last hour gives you time to prepare, and Pruitt doesn't give his opponents time." She looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who has been running calculations in her head all night and has arrived at the same conclusion independently. "Then why are we standing here talking?" "Because I need to move. I need to be on the ridge above the road before noon. If they come from town, they'll use the entry road. It's the only approach with enough room for 7 horses abreast. The ridge overlooks that road for 300 yards in both directions. I'll see them before they see the farmhouse." "And me?" "Stay inside. Keep the carbine loaded. Don't open the door for anyone who isn't me. If you hear shooting, stay down. The walls are thick enough to stop a pistol round at distance. They won't be thick enough at close range. which is why I won't let it get to close range." He did not wait for her response. He walked to the barn, saddled the horse, and rode east along the tree line, keeping under the cottonwood canopy until the farmhouse was behind him. Then he turned north and followed the creek bed, dry this time of year, its banks high enough to hide a horse and rider from anyone on the road above. He rode for 40 minutes, staying in the creek bed the entire time, until he reached the point where the drainage turned east and climbed toward the ridgeline that overlooked the entry road. He dismounted at the base of the ridge and studied the terrain on foot for 2 hours. This was the part that most men skipped, the part that separated a man who survived a fight from a man who won one. Most men found a position and waited. The stranger did not wait. He mapped. He walked the ridgeline from end to end, 600 yards of limestone shelf and scrub brush, with 3 distinct rises and 2 depressions, where a man could lie flat and be invisible from below. He tested the sight lines from each position. From the first rise, the view of the entry road was clear for 400 yards, but cut off at the point where the road curved around the base of the ridge, a blind spot of perhaps 80 yards, where riders could dismount and approach on foot without being seen. From the second rise, the view of the road was shorter, 200 yards, but the blind spot was eliminated because the curve of the ridge gave him a lateral angle on the approach. From the depression between the 2 rises, he could see the farmhouse itself, 300 yards to the south, and the full sweep of the open ground between the ridge and the fence line. He chose the depression, not for the view, for the geometry. The depression sat at the intersection of 3 sight lines: the road to the east, the farmhouse to the south, and the tree line to the west, where his retreat would be if retreat became necessary. A man in that position could cover all 3 approaches without moving more than his head. The limestone shelf provided natural cover from the roadside. The scrub brush broke his silhouette from the farmhouse side, and the slope behind him dropped into the dry creek bed, which led back to the cottonwood canopy and the tree cover that would take him out of the valley entirely if the mathematics stopped working. He spent another 30 minutes studying the approach from below. He walked the road itself, from the curve to the point where it straightened toward the farmhouse, counting paces, noting the ground surface, packed earth and loose gravel, which meant horses would make noise at a walk and significant noise at a trot, which meant he would hear them coming for at least 200 yards before they reached the curve. He noted the fence line and its posts, oak, weathered, spaced 15 feet apart, which meant a rider could not easily use them as cover because the spacing was too wide. He noted the gate, the same gate where the removal order had been nailed. The gate was open. It had been open since Tuesday, which meant Pruitt's men had left it open deliberately, the way a man leaves a door unlocked when he intends to return soon. He walked back up the ridge and returned to the depression. He lay flat on the limestone shelf and looked through the rifle sights at the road, the curve, the gate, the fence line, the farmhouse, and the open ground between. He counted the seconds it would take a man on horseback to cover each segment at a walk, a trot, and a gallop. He calculated the angles. He noted that a man riding through the gate would have to turn left to reach the farmhouse door, and during that turn his right hand, his draw hand, would be on the inside of the arc, which meant it would be momentarily blocked from the view of anyone on the ridge by his own body and the horse's neck. That half-second of obscured draw hand was the kind of detail that decided outcomes. He was satisfied with the position by mid-morning. He rode back to the farmhouse, following the creek bed again, and arrived just as Vera Caldwell was hanging laundry on the line, a small, deliberate act of normalcy in a week that had been anything but normal. She watched him ride in. She did not stop hanging laundry. That was a choice, and he understood it. She was telling him, and herself, that this was still her house, and she would continue to live in it as long as she was standing. "I've found a position on the ridge," he said. "I'll be there before sundown. If they come tonight, I'll see them from above. If they come at dawn, I'll have been there all night." "You said Pruitt wouldn't wait for the deadline." "I said he probably won't. Men like Pruitt don't test deadlines. They test resolve. He wants to know if you'll still be here tomorrow morning. If you are, he sends Harlan and the men, because a woman still standing after a removal order is a woman who needs the lesson made permanent." "What lesson?" "The one that tells every other family in the valley that resistance is more expensive than leaving." She finished hanging the last shirt. She turned to face him. The sun was on her face and in her hair, and she was 32 years old, and she had been a widow for 2 years and a landowner for 5. And the combination of those two facts had given her a quality that was not quite hardness and not quite patience, but something in between. A kind of steady-state refusal to bend that was all the more remarkable for being completely quiet. "He won't break me," she said. The stranger looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I know." He ate. He checked the rifle for the 3rd time. Lever action smooth, magazine full, the specific tension of the trigger pull exactly where he expected it. He filled both canteens. He put Birch's ledger inside his coat, wrapped in the oilcloth Birch had used, and buttoned the coat closed. He took the Spencer carbine from the table and checked its load. 7 rounds in the tube, 1 in the chamber, hammer on half-cock. He set it back on the table. "That's yours," he said. "Keep it close." He rode out at 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still 2 hours above the ridge, which gave him time to reach the position, settle in, and watch the road during the hour when riders would be most visible against the eastern sky. He followed the creek bed again, dismounted at the base of the ridge, and led the horse up the back slope to the depression. He tied the animal in a shallow overhang of limestone, sheltered from the road, sheltered from the farmhouse, but close enough that the horse's ears would still track anything moving below. He tied the knot. 3 wraps, a half hitch, patient. He settled into the depression with the rifle across his forearms, and his body flat against the limestone. The road was clear. The farmhouse was quiet. The laundry on the line moved slightly in a breeze that had not existed an hour ago and would not exist an hour from now. A transient current of air that told him the temperature was dropping, which told him the evening would be clear, which told him visibility would be good past sundown. He noted this. Good visibility worked for him. Men approaching on horseback against a darkening eastern sky would be silhouettes. He would see them long before they saw the ridge. He waited. The sun dropped. The shadows lengthened across the road, the fence line, the open ground. The farmhouse lamps came on. The silhouette of the woman moved behind the curtains. The stranger watched all of this from 300 yards away and felt nothing except the steady, mechanical calm of a man who has positioned himself correctly and is now waiting for the variable to arrive. The variable came at 9:30. Not 7 men. 2. 2 riders on the road, moving at a walk, no lanterns, no calls, riding in the dark with the confidence of men who knew the road well enough to navigate it by memory. The stranger watched them through the rifle sights. He could not make out faces at this distance in this light, but he could read their posture. The lead rider sat straight and controlled, which meant he was experienced. The second rider sat lower and shifted more, which meant he was less experienced or less comfortable in the dark. Both men were armed, long guns across their saddles, the silhouettes unmistakable. They stopped at the gate. The lead rider dismounted and walked to the farmhouse door. He did not knock. He placed something on the step, a paper, a board, something flat, and remounted. The two riders turned and rode back the way they had come. The entire visit took 4 minutes. The stranger did not move. He watched the riders disappear around the curve. He counted to 60. Then he counted to 60. Again. Then he descended the ridge, crossed the open ground at a jog, and reached the farmhouse door. The thing on the step was a board. Nailed to the board was a piece of paper. The paper said, in handwriting that was neat and practiced, and not the handwriting of either rider: Final notice. Vacate by sundown Friday, or the property will be reclaimed by force under authority of Territorial Grazing Lease 1878 T447 and the order of Judge Raymond Caldwell. The stranger read it twice. He noted the name. Raymond Caldwell. Not a coincidence. A territorial judge sharing a surname with the victim was either a relative attempting to add insult to authority, or it was a deliberate choice by Pruitt to use the name as a psychological weapon. He did not know which yet. He filed it. He looked up. Vera Caldwell was standing in the doorway. She had seen the riders from the window. She had not opened the door while they were here. She had done what he told her. "Pruitt's not waiting," she said. "No, he's sending scouts, testing whether you've left. They'll report back that you haven't, and then Harlan comes with the full crew." "When?" "Tomorrow, before sundown. He'll want to finish this before the deadline expires, because finishing it early sends a louder message than finishing it on time." She looked at the paper in his hand. "Judge Raymond Caldwell," she said. "Henry's uncle." The stranger paused. He looked at the name again. Then he looked at her. "Henry's uncle is the judge signing these orders?" "Henry's father's brother. He disowned Henry when we married. Said the homestead claim was foolishness. When Pruitt came to the valley, Raymond sold his own acreage to the company for 3 times its value and took the bench. He's been signing removal orders for every family Pruitt targets." The stranger filed this. A corrupt judge who had sold his own family's land to the company and was now using his authority to dispossess the family that had refused to sell. The cruelty was not incidental. It was personal, and personal cruelty was a weakness, because personal cruelty meant the judge had a stake in the outcome, and a man with a stake in the outcome was a man who made mistakes when the outcome changed. He handed her the board. "Keep this. It's evidence." "Of what?" "Of a territorial judge signing orders for a company that paid him for his own land. A federal circuit judge will find that interesting." He walked back to the ridge. He climbed to the depression and settled in again, rifle across his forearms, body flat against the limestone. The road was empty. The farmhouse lamps were still on. The horse was standing in the overhang, ears up, tracking the darkness. He had one more day. The telegram to Fort Worth had been sent Tuesday evening and Wednesday noon. A response would take 2 to 4 days, depending on the federal clerk's workload, which meant the earliest possible arrival was Thursday, tomorrow, and the latest was Saturday, which would be too late. He could not depend on the telegram. He could not depend on the federal court responding in time. He could depend on 2 things: Henry Croft's original filing, which predated Pruitt's charter by 2 years, and Birch's ledger, which documented 3 years of fraud with the confession of the man who had committed it. He could also depend on the terrain. He had spent 2 hours mapping it. He knew every rise, every depression, every sight line, every blind spot. He knew where a rider would have to slow down, where a horse would lose footing on the loose gravel, where the fence line created a channel that funneled movement toward the gate. He knew the distance from the ridge to the farmhouse, and the time it would take to cover it at different speeds. He knew the angle of the sun at different hours and how it would affect visibility. He knew one more thing. He knew that 7 men riding into a yard with orders to remove a woman by force expected the woman to be alone. They expected a farmhouse, a Spencer carbine, and a widow who had held on longer than the others, but would break the way the others had broken. They did not expect a man on the ridge with a rifle and a ledger, and the patience to wait until the geometry was exactly right. He lay in the dark and listened to the horse breathe. Dawn came. Thursday. 1 day before the deadline, the sky went from black to gray to pale gold, and the stranger watched the road and saw nothing. No riders, no scouts. The road was empty from the curve to the gate and beyond. The farmhouse was quiet. The laundry on the line from yesterday was still there, unmoving, because the morning air was still. He waited until full light. Then he descended the ridge, crossed to the farmhouse, and knocked twice. She opened the door. The carbine was in her hand. "No one came," she said. "They will." "When?" "Today, late. He'll send them in the last hour of daylight, so they arrive at sundown, when the deadline expires. He wants it to look legal. He wants to be able to say they arrived at the appointed hour and executed the order." "And if the telegram comes?" "It hasn't come yet. I'll check the office in town at noon." "Ride careful." He looked at her. She was not telling him to be careful for his own sake. She was telling him because she had made a calculation and understood that the man standing in her doorway with a rifle and no name was the only thing between her land and a company that had taken 14 others, and if something happened to him on the road to town, she would be alone when Harlan came. "I'll be back by 2, he said. He rode to Caldwell Flats. He followed the creek bed until it met the road a mile from town, then took the road at a steady walk. He tied the horse at the telegraph office with the patient knot and went inside. The operator, a young man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his desk. "Filing number 1876 F3320, the stranger said. "Any response from Fort Worth?" The operator checked his log. He ran his finger down a column of numbers. He looked up. "Received this morning, 9:47. He handed the stranger a folded paper. The stranger opened it and read it standing at the counter. "Filing number 1876 F3312, confirmed. Federal preemption claim registered March 14, 1876, under Section 2259, Homestead Act. Priority status, established. No conflicting federal claims on record. Signed, Clerk of the Federal Circuit Court, Fort Worth, Texas." The stranger read it twice. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat, next to Birch's ledger and Vera Caldwell's original filing. 3 documents. 3 pieces of evidence that, taken together, made Pruitt's state charter nothing more than expensive paper. He paid for the telegram. He walked to his horse. He untied the knot and mounted, and the horse's ears came forward, not flat, not pinned, but forward, the position that meant the animal had registered the change in its rider's posture, the slight shift in weight and hand pressure that came when a man who had been carrying uncertainty replaced it with certainty. The stranger rode north. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The telegram had arrived. The federal court had confirmed the priority filing. The clock was still running, but the arithmetic had changed. He arrived at the farmhouse at 2 minutes past 2. Vera Caldwell was on the porch. She saw his face and knew before he spoke. "It came," she said. "It came." He dismounted and tied the horse at the fence line. 3 wraps. A half hitch. The same patient knot he had tied on Tuesday evening when he first arrived, because the knot was not just a way of securing a horse. It was a declaration, a physical statement that the man who tied it was not going anywhere until the work was finished. "Tomorrow they come," he said. Harlan and 6 men. At sundown, they'll ride through the gate and cross the open ground, and they will expect to find you alone. And they won't. No, they won't. He walked to the barn. He set the rifle against the stall wall. He took out the telegram, the original filing, and Birch's ledger, and he laid them side by side on the hay bale and read them one more time, in order from first to last. The sequence was what mattered now. Not the individual documents, the sequence. The federal filing first to establish priority, the telegram second to confirm it, Birch's ledger third to demonstrate the fraud, and Birch himself, if the federal agent wanted testimony, willing to stand in a room and say, "I wrote every word of it." The sun moved across the sky. The shadows shortened and lengthened again. The stranger sat in the barn and did not move except to check the rifle and the horse and the road. The farmhouse lamps came on. The silhouette moved behind the curtains. The laundry on the line swayed once, in a breeze that came from the east and carried the smell of dry grass and distant cattle. Tomorrow was Friday. The deadline. The day Pruitt's men would come to finish what 14 removal orders had started. The stranger was ready. One day left. The silence before dawn had a texture to it, not soft, not peaceful, but dense, like the air inside a held breath. The stranger lay in the depression on the ridge with his cheek against the limestone and his eyes on the road, and he did not move. He had not moved since 4 o'clock. The horse stood in the overhang behind him, ears up, the specific stillness of an animal that has been listening all night and has not yet found a reason to shift its weight. The farmhouse below was dark. The lamps had been extinguished before midnight, not because Vera Caldwell had slept, but because she had understood, without being told, that a lit window made a silhouette, and a silhouette made a target. The laundry on the line was still there, 2 shirts and a sheet, motionless in the pre-dawn air. The gate was open. The step was empty. The board, with the final notice, had been taken inside, where it sat on the table next to the Spencer carbine and the strong box containing 4 documents that predated every fraudulent claim Pruitt Land Cattle had ever filed. The stranger checked the sky. The eastern horizon was still black, but the black had thinned at its lowest edge, becoming a bruise-colored line that would be gray in 10 minutes and gold in 20. He had calculated that Pruitt's men would arrive in the last hour of daylight, not at dawn. Pruitt wanted the optics of a legal execution, men arriving at the appointed hour to enforce a signed order. But the stranger had also calculated that Pruitt was not the only variable. Harlan was. And Harlan was the kind of man who arrived early when early meant surprise. The first sound came at 5:20. Not hoofbeats, not voices. A bird, a mockingbird, high in the cottonwood canopy, broke its pre-dawn silence with a single call, then stopped. The stranger knew that sound. A mockingbird that starts and stops means something disturbed it. The disturbance could be a fox, a snake, or a man. The stranger raised his head and looked east along the road. Nothing. He waited. The mockingbird called again. The same note, the same abrupt stop. Then silence. The horse's ears rotated east. Both of them, simultaneously, like 2 rifle barrels tracking the same target. The stranger did not need to see. The horse had already confirmed. Something was on the road, approaching from the direction of Caldwell Flats, and it was close enough to disturb a bird in the canopy. He settled his cheek back against the limestone and looked through the rifle sights. They came around the curve at a walk, 7 riders in a column, single file, the only formation that made sense on a road narrow enough that 2 abreast would brush the fence posts. Harlan was at the front. The stranger recognized him from Tuesday. The same posture, straight and controlled, the same way of holding the reins with the left hand while the right rested on the thigh, keeping the draw arm free. Behind him, 6 men. The stranger counted them as they emerged from the curve. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The last man was the one from Tuesday who had looked back twice, the watcher, the one who had been assigned to monitor the property for movement. He was riding with a shotgun across his saddle now, which meant Pruitt had upgraded the equipment since Tuesday, which meant this was not a scouting visit. 7 men, 7 horses, 3 rifles visible, 2 shotguns, 2 men carrying only sidearms, but sitting their saddles with the specific looseness of professionals who did not need long guns because they had already decided how close they would get before the work started. The stranger noted each one. He noted the order they rode in, because order told him hierarchy. The men in front were the ones Harlan trusted most. The men in back were the ones assigned to cover the retreat if retreat became necessary. And the man in the middle was the one Harlan had put between the 2 groups, because he was either the best shot or the most expendable, and the stranger could not yet tell which. They stopped at the gate. Harlan raised his hand. The column halted. For a long moment, no one moved. Harlan was looking at the farmhouse. The door was closed. The windows were dark. The laundry on the line was still, and the absence of smoke from the chimney meant either the woman had left or she was inside with the stove cold because she had been waiting, not cooking. "Spread out," Harlan said, his voice carried in the still air. 2 at the fence line on each side, 3 to the door. Nobody fires until I say. The men dismounted. The sound of boots hitting packed earth was a dull percussion that the stranger heard clearly from 300 yards. The horses shifted, snorted, stood where they were told to stand. 2 men looped their reins over fence posts and moved left. 2 more moved right. Harlan and 2 others walked through the gate and started across the open ground toward the farmhouse. The stranger watched all of this through the rifle sights. He had the crosshairs on the space between Harlan's shoulder blades. He did not move his finger to the trigger. Not yet. The geometry was not right. The 2 men at the left fence line were still walking, still spreading, and until they stopped and established their positions, he could not calculate the full field. Patience was not a virtue in this moment. It was a tactical requirement. The 3 men at the farmhouse door stopped 10 feet from the porch. Harlan was in front. The 2 behind him flanked slightly left and right, the standard formation for a forced entry. The lead man approaches the door while the men behind him cover the windows. Harlan reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He held it up, not for the woman inside to see, but for his own men, the way a man holds up a badge he has bought and does not quite believe in. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called, "by authority of Territorial Grazing Lease, 1878, T447, and the order of Judge Raymond Caldwell, you are hereby ordered to vacate these premises. You have 5 minutes to open this door and come out, or we will come in." Silence from the farmhouse. No movement at the windows, no sound from inside. The stranger noted this. She was doing exactly what he had told her. Staying down, staying quiet, keeping the carbine loaded and the door closed. Harlan waited. He was a man who understood the theater of intimidation. The 5 minutes was not real. It was a performance, a public declaration for the benefit of any witness who might later be asked to confirm that the removal had been conducted with proper notice. The witness, of course, would be one of his own men. The stranger counted the seconds. At 240, 4 minutes, Harlan nodded to the man on his left. The man stepped forward and raised his boot to kick the door. The stranger fired. Not at the man. Not at the door. At the ground 3 feet in front of the kicker's boot, where the bullet hit the packed earth and kicked up a spray of gravel that peppered the man's shin and sent him stumbling backward with a curse that was more surprise than pain. Every man in the yard froze. The sound of the shot had come from the ridge, from above and to the right, from a position none of them had checked, because they had come to the farmhouse expecting a woman with a Spencer carbine and had not considered the possibility that the woman had something the 14 previous families had not had: a man with a rifle and 3 days of preparation. Harlan's head snapped toward the ridge. His hand was on his gun. The 2 men at the fence lines had dropped to one knee and were scanning the ridge with their rifles, but they were scanning too high. The stranger was in the depression, below the crest, and from the road the depression was invisible against the limestone shelf. They could not see him. They could hear him, because he spoke. "Step away from her." The voice came from the ridge, clear and flat, carrying across 300 yards of open ground with the specific clarity of sound that moves through cold, still air at dawn. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the kind of voice that does not ask and does not threaten. It states, the way a fact states itself, and the statement leaves no room for negotiation because the negotiation had already happened, in silence, over 3 days, and this was the conclusion. No one laughed. This is the part worth pausing on. 7 armed men in a widow's yard at dawn, and a voice from a ridge tells them to step back, and not one of them laughs. They do not laugh because they are professionals, and professionals know what a rifle shot from an unseen position means. It means the man on that ridge has been there long enough to choose his first shot carefully, a warning, not a kill, which means he could have chosen differently. It means he has a line of sight on the yard, the fence line, the gate, and the road, which means every man standing in the open ground is a silhouette against pale earth, and the man above them has the sun at his back, and the limestone at his chest, and the patience to wait for the geometry to become undeniable. They do not laugh because the voice did not ask them to leave. It told them to step away from her. The specificity of that phrase, not leave this property, not get off this land, but step away from her, told every man in the yard that the man on the ridge knew exactly who was in the doorway and exactly what the 7 men had come to do. And he had decided, before the first horse came around the curve, that it was not going to happen. Harlan stood in the open ground with the removal order in his left hand, and his right hand on his gun, and his eyes on the ridge, and he made a calculation. The calculation was simple. The man on the ridge had a rifle and a line of sight and the first shot, and Harlan had a revolver and open ground and no cover. The math was bad. Harlan was many things, but he was not stupid. "You Pruitts?" Harlan called toward the ridge. No answer. "I said, you Pruitts, because this is a legal removal under territorial authority. You interfere with a court order. That's a federal offense." The voice from the ridge said, "Read the seal on that paper." Harlan looked at the removal order in his hand. He had not read it carefully. He had not needed to. Pruitt had handed it to him with the address and the deadline and the instruction to remove, and Harlan had written. But now, in the silence after the shot, with 6 men watching him and a rifle he could not see pointed at the ground between his boots, he read it. The seal was territorial. The authority was a territorial judge. The grazing lease it cited was a state charter. "The seal is territorial," Harlan said. "Correct. What of it?" "The land you're standing on was filed as a federal preemption claim in 1876. Under federal law, a federal filing predates and supersedes a state grazing lease. That removal order is based on a charter that has no legal standing over this property." Harlan's jaw tightened. The stranger could see it from 300 yards. The specific way the muscles in the jaw bunch when a man who is used to being in control realizes that the control was never real. "That's a legal opinion," Harlan said. "I'm not here for opinions. I'm here for Pruitt. You're here for a man who forged a survey to cover 14 homesteads that were filed before his company existed. The surveyor who drew the false map kept the real one. It's in the hands of someone who will be presenting it to a federal circuit judge." "Who?" "The man who drew the map, Tom Birch." The name landed in the yard the way a stone lands in still water, with a ripple that reached every man standing there. Two of the men at the fence lines looked at each other. The man who had been kicked back from the door was standing again, rubbing his shin, and his expression had changed from pain to something more complicated. The specific look of a man who is hearing information that reorders his understanding of why he is standing in a widow's yard at dawn. Harlan did not move. He stood with the paper in his hand, and his eyes on the ridge, and his jaw working the way a jaw works when the mouth is trying to form words that the brain has not yet approved. "You're bluffing," Harlan said. "I don't bluff, I count." "Count what?" 7 men, 3 rifles, 2 shotguns, 2 sidearms. The man on the left fence line has his weight on his back foot, which means he's preparing to move. The man on the right fence line has not raised his rifle, which means he's already decided not to fire. You have your hand on your gun, but your thumb is not on the hammer, which means you haven't decided. The man at the door was ordered to kick it in, and I stopped him with a warning shot, which means I had the option to stop him permanently and chose not to. That choice is not permanent. Step away from her. The silence that followed had a specific quality, not the silence of fear. The silence of arithmetic. 7 men had come to remove a woman from her home, and they had found not a widow with a carbine, but a man on a ridge with a rifle and a federal filing and the name of the surveyor who could bring down the entire company, and the arithmetic of their situation had changed in the space of 1 warning shot and 1 voice. The 2 men at the fence lines were still kneeling, but they had stopped scanning the ridge. They were looking at Harlan. The man at the door had stepped back to the porch, not forward. The man in the middle of the formation, the one Harlan had placed between the 2 groups, had lowered his rifle and was looking at the gate, which was the direction they had come, and the direction most of them were now calculating they would need to go. Harlan felt it. He felt the formation shifting beneath him, the way a captain feels a crew shifting. Not through words, but through the small physical changes, the way a man's weight settles differently when he's no longer committed. The way a rifle barrel dips when the man holding it has decided, consciously or not, that the fight he's standing in is not the fight he signed up for. "Who are you?" Harlan called. "The man who's going to stand here until you leave." "Pruitt will hear about this." "Pruitt is going to hear about a lot of things, not from me. From a federal circuit judge in Fort Worth who received a telegram 2 days ago confirming that every acre Pruitt claims under his state charter was filed as federal homestead land 4 years before his company existed. The specific moment when a man's certainty drains, not all at once, but in stages, the way water drains from a cracked vessel, each crack releasing a little more until the structure is still standing but empty. That moment was visible on Harlan's face. He had come to this yard with a document and a deadline and 6 men, and he was discovering that the document was worthless, the deadline was artificial, and 6 men could not solve a problem that existed 300 yards above them on a limestone shelf. He lowered his hand from his gun. "Mount up," he said to his men. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way a man says something he will later have to explain to someone who will not accept the explanation, and the weight of that future conversation was already on his face. The men moved. The 2 at the fence lines rose and walked back to their horses. The man at the door stepped off the porch. The man with the shotgun walked backward toward the gate, keeping his eyes on the ridge, because even in retreat, a professional does not turn his back on a rifle he cannot see. Harlan was the last to mount. He sat his horse in the open ground and looked at the farmhouse, then at the ridge, then at the removal order still in his hand. He folded it once, without looking at it, and tucked it inside his coat. "This isn't over," he said. "Your part is," the voice from the ridge said. Harlan turned his horse and rode through the gate. The 6 men fell in behind him, single file, the same formation they had arrived in, but reversed. The watcher was now in front, riding fastest, and the man who had been in the middle was now at the rear, riding slowest, because the rear guard in a retreat is the man who has accepted the most risk and is the most likely to look back. The stranger watched them ride east along the road until they passed the curve and disappeared. He counted to 100. Then he counted to 100 again. Then he lowered the rifle and stood up from the depression. The farmhouse door opened. Vera Caldwell stepped onto the porch with the Spencer carbine in her right hand and the removal order board in her left, and she looked up at the ridge. She could not see him. The depression was below the crest, invisible from the farmhouse, but she knew where the voice had come from, and she knew what it had done, and she stood in the doorway of the house her husband had built, and she did not cry, and she did not speak. She simply stood there, in the morning light, holding a weapon and an evidence board, and she breathed. The stranger descended the ridge, crossed the open ground, and reached the fence line. He untied the horse from the limestone overhang on his way down and led the animal across the open ground by the reins, walking slowly, not because he was tired, but because the yard was still a field of engagement, and a man who moves slowly through a field of engagement is a man who has not yet decided the engagement is over. He stopped at the fence. He looked at her. She looked at him. "They'll be back," she said. "Not today. Not with the same men. Harlan just lost his crew. The 2 men on the fence lines had already decided not to fire before I told them to step back. The man at the door was more scared of the shot than committed to the job. Harlan felt them leave and he pulled them out because staying meant losing control of men who were already gone." "And Pruitt?" "Pruitt sits behind a desk. He sends men because men are cheaper than land and more reliable than law. But the men he sent just failed, and the document they carried was just challenged by a voice from a ridge that named the federal filing, the surveyor, and the circuit court. Pruitt will hear about it by noon. He'll do one of 2 things. He'll send more men, or he'll go to his judge. Either way, tomorrow is the day this ends." "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow the federal land agent arrives. I sent the telegram on Tuesday. I confirmed it on Wednesday. The response arrived Thursday morning. Priority status confirmed, no conflicting federal claims. The agent will be on tomorrow's stage. When he arrives, I'll present the filing, the confirmation, the ledger, and Tom Birch. Pruitt's charter will be dissolved before sundown." She set the carbine against the doorframe. She set the board on the porch rail. She looked at the yard where 7 men had stood 5 minutes ago, and where now there was nothing but hoof prints in the dust, and the smell of horse sweat, and the specific silence that follows the end of a threat that had seemed, for a long time, permanent. "What if Pruitt sends more men tonight?" "I'll be on the ridge." "You've been on the ridge for 2 nights. I'll be there for 1 more." She looked at him for a long time. The morning sun was full on his face now, and she could see what she had not been able to see clearly before. The way his eyes moved, constantly, checking the road, the tree line, the fence, the sky, never resting, never satisfied that the geometry was fully mapped. He was a man who lived in a state of permanent assessment, and she understood, with the specific clarity of a woman who has been alone for 2 years and has learned to read the men who come to her door. that this man would stand on that ridge until the work was done, and then he would leave, and he would not look back, and he would not give her a name to remember him by, and that was not cruelty. It was the way he was built. "Eat something before you go back up there," she said. He ate. Cornbread and dried meat, the same meal as the first night, because it was what she had, and it was enough. He drank water from the canteen and refilled it from the pump. He checked the rifle, he checked the horse, he checked the road one more time, east and west, both directions. The way a man checks a perimeter he has already checked a dozen times, because the checking is not about doubt. It is about discipline, and discipline is what keeps a man alive between the moment the threat leaves and the moment it returns. He rode back to the ridge at mid-morning. He tied the horse at the limestone overhang with the patient knot. He settled into the depression with the rifle and the ledger and the telegram and the filing, and he watched the road. The road was empty. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows shortened and lengthened. The farmhouse was quiet. The laundry on the line moved once in a breeze that came from nowhere and went nowhere. The stranger lay on the limestone and waited, and the horse stood behind him with its ears up, and the valley was still, and the day passed. By late afternoon, he had read Birch's ledger for the 4th time. He had memorized the page numbers and the sequence. He had rehearsed, silently, the order in which he would present each document to the federal agent. The filing first, the confirmation second, the ledger third, Birch's confession fourth. He had rehearsed the specific language he would use, not emotional language, not accusatory language, but the flat, factual language of a man presenting evidence to an authority that operated on documents rather than feelings. The sun touched the western ridgeline. The shadows stretched across the yard, the fence line, the road. The farmhouse lamps came on. The silhouette moved behind the curtains. Dusk fell. The valley went dark. The stranger lay on the ridge and listened to the horse breathe and watched the road for riders that did not come. Pruitt had not sent more men. Not tonight. Which meant Pruitt was making a different calculation, not a tactical one, but a strategic one. He was not going to solve this with force. He was going to solve it with the authority he believed he owned, the judge, the charter, the system he had purchased. He was going to come himself. The stranger knew this the way he knew the terrain, not from evidence but from pattern, from the specific behavior of men who had controlled a territory for years and could not conceive of a world in which that control was temporary. Pruitt would come, not Harlan, not the 6 men. Pruitt. And when he came, he would bring the one thing he believed was invincible, the law as he had arranged it. The stranger closed his eyes. The horse breathed. The night passed. Dawn. Friday. The deadline. The day Pruitt's charter ended. The dawn broke on Friday with no color at all. A pale, flat light that spread across the valley like water finding its own level, filling every depression and gully and fold of earth without urgency, without heat, without the golden edge that sometimes came with a day that mattered. The stranger stood in the barn doorway and watched it arrive, and felt nothing particular about it, except the recognition that the light was adequate for what needed to happen next. The horse was saddled. The rifle was loaded. The 3 documents, the federal filing, Birch's ledger, and the telegram confirmation from Fort Worth, were wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside his coat, arranged in the exact sequence he had rehearsed in his mind during the hours between midnight and 4 o'clock. Federal filing first, telegram second, ledger third. He did not ride toward the farmhouse. He rode toward the road. The calculation was simple, and it was old, the kind of arithmetic that a man carries with him through enough territories and enough valleys and enough mornings that look exactly like this one. Pruitt would come with authority. Not Harlan's kind. The kind that arrives on horseback with rifles and canvas-wrapped contracts, and the specific confidence of men who have done this before. Pruitt's kind was different. It was the kind that wore clean clothes and carried documents with seals, and believed that the seal was the same thing as the truth. He would bring the territorial judge's removal order. He would bring the charter. He would bring whatever paperwork he believed made the valley his. The stranger had seen this in Tucson, in Laramie, in a dozen other towns with different names and the same geometry of power. The man behind the desk always brought the documents. The stranger brought different ones. He stopped the horse at the fence line, where the road met the homestead's southern boundary, and dismounted and waited. He did not go to the farmhouse. He did not knock on Vera's door. The time for knocking was over. What was coming now would arrive on the road, and the road was where he would meet it. The sun climbed. The flat light found its temperature. The limestone on the ridge caught the heat and threw it back, and the air above the road began to shimmer in that specific way that made distant objects uncertain. A rider could be a post could be a rider, and a man standing in the road with a rifle could be a shadow or a fact, depending on how far away you were and how badly you wanted the answer to be one thing instead of the other. He heard them before he saw them. Hooves. Not two this time. Not the reconnaissance riders from the night before. More. The rhythm was wrong for a herd, too deliberate, too spaced, too controlled. These were men riding in formation, which meant they had a leader, which meant they had a purpose, which meant the purpose was the farmhouse behind him and the woman inside it. The horse's ears fixed on the road. East. Steady. 7 riders emerged from the heat shimmer in a column of 2 and 2 and 2 and 1, and the one at the back was not Harlan. He was older, clean-shaven. He wore a coat that was too heavy for the weather and sat a horse that was too well fed for ranch work, and carried himself with the specific posture of a man who had spent so many years giving orders from behind a desk that the act of sitting on a horse felt like a compromise, an indignity he was temporarily enduring because no stagecoach could reach this road and no carriage could cross the valley floor. Gerald Pruitt. The stranger knew him before the column was close enough to read faces. He knew him the way you know a man's name by the shape of the system he built. 14 families, 14 removal orders, 14 homesteads absorbed into a single company charter by surveys that drew creeks in the wrong direction and moved ridgelines 2 miles from where nature had placed them. The man who built that system would not send Harlan to finish the last homestead. He would come himself because the last homestead was the only one that had refused to dissolve, and a man like Pruitt could not tolerate refusal. It was not the land. It was the principle. The valley was his because he had decided it was his, and the woman in the farmhouse was a variable he had not yet eliminated, and variables bothered him the way a misplaced number bothers an accountant, not with anger, but with a mechanical irritation that demanded correction. The column stopped 30 yards from the fence. Harlan was in front, as expected. He sat his horse and looked at the stranger, and did not speak because he had already spoken once in this yard, and the result had not been what he planned, and a man who has been told that his employer's entire legal foundation is built on fraud does not generally open the second conversation with confidence. He looked back at Pruitt. Pruitt did not look at Harlan. He looked at the farmhouse. Then he looked at the stranger. "You're the one who sent the telegram," Pruitt said. The stranger said nothing. "Fort Worth confirmed receipt. My attorney received notice yesterday." Pruitt's voice was the voice of a man who has spent 30 years explaining to people why his position is correct. Not arguing, explaining, because in his experience the distinction was unnecessary. People did not argue with him. They listened, and then they agreed, or they left. The Federal Circuit Court has scheduled a review of the Croft filing and the competing charter claims. That review will take months. In the meantime, the Territorial Court's removal order remains in effect. This land is... The federal filing predates your charter by 2 years. It was the first thing the stranger had said since Pruitt arrived. He said it without emphasis, without raising his voice, without the theatrical weight that men sometimes put on facts they consider decisive. He said it the way a surveyor reads a measurement, correctly once, and without the expectation that the number would change because someone found it inconvenient. "That is the dispute," Pruitt said, "which is why the court has..." "There is no dispute." The stranger reached inside his coat. He did it slowly, the way a man moves when he knows that 7 guns are watching his hands, and the margin between careful and dead is measured in how quickly his elbow bends. He withdrew the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it on the fence post and laid the documents out in the order he had planned. The federal filing on the left, the telegram in the center, the ledger on the right. This is Henry Caldwell's federal preemption filing, March 1876, signed, sealed, and processed by the Federal Land Office. The margin notation reads, "Preemption priority established. No conflicting claims on file at time of registration. Your company was not chartered until 1878. The filing predates your existence." Pruitt looked at the document. His face did not change. "This is a telegram from the Federal Circuit Court in Fort Worth, confirming receipt of the filing and acknowledging jurisdiction. The review you mentioned is not a review of whether the Caldwell claim is valid. It is a review of whether your charter should have been issued at all." The second telegram sat on the fence post. Pruitt read it. His jaw moved, not a clench, not a tick, but the slow, controlled adjustment of a man whose teeth have shifted inside his mouth, and he has not yet decided whether to acknowledge it. "And this..." The stranger placed his hand on the ledger. He did not open it yet. "Tom Birch kept this." Pruitt's face changed. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of collapse that makes for a good story in a saloon afterward. It was smaller than that and worse than that, because it was the specific recognition, visible only in the eyes, only for a moment, gone before a bystander could name it, that a man who was supposed to be gone, who was supposed to have destroyed what needed destroying and disappeared into the bottle, and the silence and the slow erosion of a guilty conscience, had not done any of those things. He had kept everything, and someone had found him. "Birch is dead," Pruitt said. "He was sober yesterday afternoon when he agreed to testify." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man thinking. It was the silence of a man recalculating. Not the math, because the math was already settled, but the response, the next move, the angle of escape from a room he had not realized he had walked into until the door closed behind him. The charter is a state instrument. The filing is federal. Federal priority is not a matter of opinion, Mr. Pruitt. It is a matter of sequence. Your charter cannot cover land that was already claimed under federal law 2 years before your company existed. Pruitt looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the fence post. The 6 men behind them had not moved, had not spoken, had not shifted their weight, because the conversation they were listening to was not the conversation they had been hired for. They had been hired to remove a widow from a farmhouse. They had not been hired to watch a territorial land empire dissolve in a man's hands in the space of 4 minutes on a dirt road in front of a property that was, as of the document now sitting on the fence post, demonstrably and federally not his. "This will be decided in court," Pruitt said. "It has been decided. The court will confirm what the documents already state. Your surveys are fraudulent. Your charter covers land that was never available. Your removal orders have no legal foundation, and the man who drew your false maps is willing to stand in front of a federal judge and say so." The stranger picked up the ledger and held it at his side and looked at Pruitt with the specific steadiness of a man who has finished speaking and is waiting for the other person to understand that the conversation is over. Pruitt understood. He did not dismount. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not call Harlan's name or gesture to the 6 men, or raise his voice, or do any of the things that a man in a story is supposed to do when the world he built turns out to be made of paper. He sat on his horse and looked at the farmhouse, at the window where Vera's silhouette stood with the Spencer carbine held at her side. And then he looked at the stranger and said, in a voice that had not changed in volume or pitch, but had lost the one thing that had always made it effective, which was certainty, "Who are you?" The stranger wrapped the documents back in the oilcloth and tucked them inside his coat and put his foot in the stirrup and mounted his horse in one motion, the way a man mounts when he has been riding long enough that the horse and the body have learned each other, and he looked down at Pruitt from the saddle with nothing particular in his face. "It doesn't matter." He rode past the column. The 7 men parted, not quickly, slowly, with the specific reluctance of men who are making room not because they have been told to, but because the math has changed, and they are experienced enough to read it. The man on the left edge, the smart one, the one who had kept his draw arm free and watched the road twice, did not look at the stranger as he passed. He looked at the ground. The ground was easier to understand. The stranger rode south. He did not look back at the farmhouse. He did not look back at the column. He rode at a walk, which is the pace of a man who is leaving because the work is done, not because the work is unfinished and he is pretending otherwise. Behind him, Pruitt did not move for a long time. The federal agent arrived on the noon stage from Fort Worth, which was 11 hours after the telegram had predicted, because the telegraph operator in Amarillo had misread the reply and sent the confirmation to the wrong office, and it had taken until morning to route it correctly. The agent was a thin man with wire spectacles and a leather case, and the specific air of a bureaucrat who has been assigned a case that he suspects will be more interesting than his salary warrants. He went first to the land registry, where Holt produced the Caldwell filing and the competing charter and the stack of surveys that Tom Birch had drawn and the stack of surveys that Tom Birch had kept, and the discrepancy between the two was large enough that the agent removed his spectacles and cleaned them and put them back on and looked again. He spent 2 hours with Birch at the boarding house. Birch was sober. Birch had been sober since Tuesday and would stay sober, which was a thing the stranger had understood from the moment he sat across from the man in the lamplight. Not from anything Birch said, but from the specific way his hands moved when he reached for the trunk under the floorboards. Steady, precise. The hands of a man who had made a decision and was no longer negotiating with himself about it. Birch gave his statement. The agent wrote it down. Birch signed it. On Saturday morning, the federal agent rode out to the Croft homestead with 2 U.S. Marshals and a stack of papers that carried the seal of the Federal Circuit Court, and he served Gerald Pruitt, who had ridden back to his ranch office and was sitting behind his desk, in his coat, in the chair he had occupied for 7 years with a glass of whiskey he had not touched, with a notice of federal review and an immediate suspension of all removal orders, all charter-based land claims, and all pending territorial court actions associated with the Pruitt Land and Cattle Company. Pruitt signed the receipt. The agent left. On Sunday, the territorial judge who had signed the removal orders resigned his position and boarded a train for El Paso and was not seen in Caldwell Flats again. On Monday, the county sheriff handed his badge to his senior deputy, a man who had been quietly documenting the sheriff's cooperation with Pruitt for 2 years, and who accepted the badge with the specific gravity of a man who had been waiting for it and had not been certain the waiting would end, and rode south. On Tuesday, Vera Caldwell stood on the porch of the farmhouse her husband had built and watched the road for riders that did not come. The road was empty, the valley was quiet, the only sound was the wind in the dry grass, and the distant movement of cattle that belonged to no company, and no charter, and no man who had not earned them with his own hands. Tom Birch came by on Wednesday. He stood at the fence line where the stranger had waited on Friday morning, and he looked at the farmhouse and he looked at the valley, and he said to Vera, "What he said is not part of this story. It belongs to them." But whatever it was, Vera nodded once, and Birch walked back to town with a posture that was different from the one he had carried for 3 years, lighter by the specific weight of a confession that someone had finally accepted. The families began returning on Thursday. The first wagon came from the south. The Mathesons, who had lost their 480-acre claim 18 months ago and had been living in a boarding house in Amarillo with 3 children and a debt that was not theirs. Then the Reeves family from the west. Then the Cordoba brothers, who had been Pruitt's neighbors before Pruitt decided neighbors were cheaper as tenants. By Saturday, 5 of the 14 families had returned to their original claims, and by the following Wednesday, 8 more had filed notices with the new deputy sheriff, the one who had kept the ledger, indicating their intent to reclaim. Vera's strongbox sat on the kitchen table where it had always been. The federal filing was back inside it, where Henry had placed it 4 years ago, and the oilcloth the stranger had wrapped it in was folded neatly on top. Vera did not move it. She did not need to look at it again. The filing was a fact now, the way the valley was a fact, the way the farmhouse was a fact, something that existed because it had been built correctly from the beginning, and no amount of paper and ink and purchased authority could make it less true. The patient knot was untied on Friday morning. The stranger had left the horse at the livery stable in Caldwell Flats on Saturday evening, the day after the confrontation on the road, with instructions to the stable hand to keep it fed and watered and to untie the knot at the fence line when the family returned. The stable hand had not understood the instruction, but had followed it anyway, because the stranger had paid exactly what the boarding cost and not a cent more, and had said, "Untie the knot," with the specific authority of a man who does not explain his requests twice. The knot sat in the dust for 6 days. On Friday morning, 1 week after the confrontation, the stable hand's son walked out to the fence line with a bucket and a brush to clean the post, and saw the knot and untied it the way you untie any knot without ceremony, and dropped the rope into the grass, and went back to his work. The horse, which had been moved to the Croft barn by then, stood in the stall with its ears relaxed for the first time since it had arrived. The animal had been listening all week. There was nothing left to listen for. The stranger did not return for the families. He did not return for Vera. He did not return for Birch, or for the deputy sheriff, or for the federal agent's report, or for the newspaper article that the Amarillo Gazette published on Thursday, with the headline "Federal Review Suspends Pruitt Land Claims," and a subheadline that said, "14 families may recover homesteads." He did not return because the work was done, and the documents were where they belonged, and the valley was filling with people who had the legal right to be there, and a man who has finished a job does not stand around watching other people enjoy the result. Where he went after Caldwell Flats is not recorded. The stable hand said he rode south. The telegraph operator in Amarillo said a man matching his description sent 1 more telegram, to a name and address the operator did not recognize, and rode out of town before noon. The bartender at the Palace Saloon said he paid for 1 glass of water, drank it standing, and left a nickel on the bar, which was exactly the price of water, and walked out without speaking. Beyond that, nothing. No name, no forwarding address, no promise to return. The valley filled with light and with people, and with the sound of hammers on new lumber and the lowing of cattle in fields that had been empty for 2 years, and the farmhouse on the hill. The one Vera had kept, the one Henry had built, the one that 14 removal orders and a forged survey and a purchased judge and 7 armed men on a Friday morning had not been able to take, stood exactly where it had always stood, unchanged, unmarked, a fact on the land that no amount of paper could erase. If this story found something in you, subscribe to Frontier Reckoning. There are more, and in every one of them, the quiet man is already 3 steps ahead.